The first thing people noticed was the silence. Not the rain, not the wind sweeping across the Kansas fields, not even the $1,000,000 machine sinking axle deep into the black earth. It was the silence that spread through Mason Creek when Walter Granger drove his faded red 1949 Farmel out of the barn. An hour earlier, some of those same men had laughed when they saw it sitting beside rows of chrome trucks and satellite-guided equipment. One man from Prairie Horizon had called it a museum piece with flat tires. But now their machine 12 tons of steel, sensors, and polished money was slowly disappearing into the soaked field like it was being swallowed alive. The deeper it sank, the quieter the crowd became. Walter shut off the Farmall beside the fence line and stared at the mud without blinking. Then he said the words nobody there would ever forget. "I warned you not to cross where the ground remembers water. If you're watching from a small town, a farm road, a quiet porch, or anywhere that still understands what old land can remember, leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories about family farms, old machines, and hard-earned respect still mean something to you, consider subscribing before we go back to where this all began." 3 weeks before that field went silent, Mason Creek was just another small Kansas town trying not to disappear. It sat in Miller County, tucked between wheat fields, soybean ground, and long gravel roads that turned white with dust in July and soft as cake batter after spring rain. There was a grain elevator on the south end of town, a feed store with faded signs in the window, a diner where the coffee tasted burnt by 6 in the morning, and a little white church whose bell had not rung straight since the tornado of '87. Walter Granger had lived there all his life. At 74, Walt moved slower than he used to, but not carelessly. He had the kind of walk old farmers get after a lifetime of stepping over ruts, wire, roots, and memory. His shoulders were bent, his hands were thick at the knuckles, and his face carried more weather than expression. Folks in Mason Creek said Walt Granger could look at a field and tell you what it would do before the clouds even made up their minds. They also said he was stubborn as a hedge post. Granger Bend Farm sat 3 miles east of town on Pine Hollow Road, where the land dipped toward an old line of cottonwood trees. Walt's father had bought the first 80 acres in 1948, back when a man could still pay on land with milk checks, hog money, and a winter's worth of repair work. The next year, he brought home a red 1949 Farmel M, shiny as a Christmas apple, and told young Walt it was not just a tractor. "It's a promise with wheels," his father had said. Walt never forgot that. Now the Farmall sat in the back bay of the barn, under a roof that leaked in 2 places. Its red paint had faded to the color of dried blood. One headlight was cracked. The seat had been patched with black tape. On the left rear fender, just above where Walt's hand often rested, 3 little slanted marks had been carved into the metal beside 2 letters almost rubbed away by time. B.P. Most people never noticed them. Walt noticed them every morning. He would feed the chickens, check the old fence, make coffee too strong for anyone but himself, and then stop by that tractor before going back to the house. Sometimes he only stood there a minute. Sometimes he wiped dust from the hood with the sleeve of his shirt. And sometimes, when the barn was quiet enough, he could almost hear his wife Ellen laughing from the doorway. telling him he treated that machine better than he treated his own knees. Ellen had been gone 6 years. Since then, the house had grown larger around him. His daughter June lived in Wichita now and came when she could, usually with her little boy Caleb riding beside her. She worried about the farm. She worried about the loan. She worried about Walt pretending not to worry. That April, a new rumor moved through Mason Creek faster than storm wind. Prairie Horizon AgTech was coming. They wanted the east ground beyond Granger Bend for a demonstration project. Satellite-guided equipment, automated planting, a machine worth more than every building on Walt's farm combined. At Mason Diner, men called it progress. At First Prairie Bank, they called it opportunity. But Walt stood at his kitchen window, looking toward the cottonwoods and the low field beyond them. His coffee went cold in his hand. Then he whispered to the empty room. They're putting weight where the ground remembers water. The meeting at Mason Creek Grange Hall filled up faster than church on Christmas Eve. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the gravel lot. Men in seed caps stood near the entrance, drinking coffee from foam cups, while women folded raffle tickets at the back tables. Everybody in Miller County had heard about Prairie Horizon AgTech by then, and most people came carrying the same quiet hope. Maybe this would save the town. Inside the hall, folding chairs scraped across the wooden floor as farmers settled in beneath old photographs of county fairs and harvest parades from decades past. The air smelled like dust, wet denim, and burnt coffee. Walter Granger sat near the back beside Buck Harlan, who smelled faintly of diesel fuel and chewing tobacco. Buck leaned over and muttered, "You know, Walt, if these boys really got tractors driving themselves now, maybe you can finally retire that old farmall." A few men nearby chuckled. Walt kept his eyes forward. At the front of the room stood a projector screen glowing bright blue. Beside it, a tall young man in a clean work jacket adjusted papers on a podium. He looked too polished for Mason Creek. His boots were new, his haircut was fresh, but he carried himself like somebody used to being listened to. That was Evan Rusk, 32 years old, lead field engineer for Prairie Horizon. He began speaking with the smooth confidence of someone who had spent years presenting numbers to rooms full of investors. "We believe Miller County can become one of the most advanced agricultural zones in the Midwest," he said. "Precision planting, autonomous field systems, reduced waste, increased yield, more jobs staying right here in Mason Creek." Pictures flashed across the screen behind him. Giant self-guided machines rolling through perfect fields. Drones sweeping over green rows. Digital maps glowing in neat colors. People nodded. Some even applauded. Then Evan showed the machine itself. A massive automated planter built low and wide, equipped with sensors, hydraulic balancing systems, and enough technology to make half the room stare like they were seeing the future arrive in real time. "Value estimated at $1.2 million, Evan said proudly. Buck gave a low whistle. Near the front row, Marlene Price from First Prairie Bank smiled like the presentation had already been approved by heaven itself. "Our Eastfield demonstration site," Evan continued, "will be located just beyond Granger Bend along the low section near the county drainage corridor." Walt's eyes narrowed. He slowly stood up before his knees could argue with him. The room quieted some. Evan offered a polite smile. "Yes, sir." Walt cleared his throat. "That ground ain't stable after spring rain." A few people shifted in their chairs. Evan answered carefully. We've already completed soil density scans and geological reviews. Walt shook his head once. That don't matter if you're crossing black bottom. Several people exchanged confused looks. The field dries wrong out there, Walt continued. Looks solid on top, ain't solid underneath. Buck sighed quietly beside him, already embarrassed for the old man. Evan kept his professional tone. Mr. Granger, I appreciate local experience. Truly. But our data shows the soil structure can safely support heavy equipment. Walt stared at the screen behind him. That ground remembers water, he said softly. For a second, nobody spoke. Then a young man near the wall snorted. Another laughed under his breath. Someone whispered, "Here we go again." The tension broke into scattered chuckles around the room. Not cruel enough to call bullying, but close enough. Walt sat back down slowly. Buck patted his arm awkwardly. You can't fight satellites with stories anymore. Walt. At the end of the meeting, while people crowded around the projector asking questions about jobs and contracts, Marlene Price approached Walt near the coffee table. Her voice stayed low. Walter, she said gently, your operating loan comes due in 6 weeks. Walt nodded once. Marlene folded her hands carefully. Prairie Horizons project could raise land value across this county. The bank's counting on stability right now. Walt looked toward the rain-speckled windows. You saying I should keep quiet? I'm saying, Marlene replied, this may not be the right time to make people nervous. Then she walked away before he could answer. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the wheat fields. And for the first time in years, Walt Granger felt something colder than debt settle into his chest. Because deep down, he knew one thing. The ground out east had not forgotten what lived beneath it. Rain moved across Miller County sometime after midnight. Not a hard storm, just a slow spring rain that tapped against the tin roof of Walt Granger's barn and soaked the fields 1 patient inch at a time. By dawn, the gravel on Pine Hollow Road looked darker, and little ribbons of water curled through the wheel ruts like silver wire. Walt had barely slept. The meeting at Grange Hall stayed with him long after the lights went out. Every laugh, every sideways glance. The way Evan Rusk had smiled politely while dismissing him like an old fence nobody wanted to tear down yet. He stood inside the barn before sunrise with a flashlight in one hand and the smell of old grease hanging thick in the cold air. The farm rested where it always had. Quiet. Waiting. Walt brushed his hand across the faded hood, then crouched beside an old wooden cabinet shoved against the wall. He opened drawer after drawer full of rusted bolts, broken gauges, receipts, seed tags, and coffee tins filled with nails sorted by decade. But the thing he wanted was nowhere there. The notebook. His father's drainage notebook. Walt could still picture it clear as daylight. Dark cloth cover. Water stains at the corners. Tiny cramped handwriting that smelled faintly of tobacco and machine oil. His father used to keep it tucked above the workbench after the flood of 1951. Back when the East Field nearly swallowed a threshing tractor whole. Never trust land that dries too clean, his father had warned. Walt straightened slowly, rubbing his aching back. Damn it, he muttered. Outside, tires crackled over wet gravel. A few moments later, June Granger stepped into the barn carrying 2 coffees in a cardboard tray while 8-year-old Caleb hurried ahead of her in rain boots too big for his feet. Caleb loved the barn, loved the smell of hay and oil and dust, loved the old pulley belts hanging from hooks, loved the farmel most of all. "There she is," the boy whispered like he was entering a church. Walt almost smiled. June handed him a coffee. "You weren't answering your phone." "I was busy." "You've been busy since 4:30 in the morning." She looked tired. Wichita had put shadows under her eyes over the years. Divorce had added the rest. Caleb climbed onto the farmall's steel step and grinned. "Grandpa, can we start it today?" "Maybe." June crossed her arms. Harper and Sons made another offer. Walt's face hardened immediately. "They'll restore it," she continued carefully. "Put it in their showroom. They're offering more than enough to cover this month's payment." "It ain't for sale." "Dad, it ain't for sale." The sharpness in his voice echoed off the rafters harder than he intended. Caleb looked down at his boots. June exhaled slowly through her nose. "You can't keep saving memories while the farm sinks around you." Walt stared past her toward the open barn doors, where rain dripped steadily from the roof edge. "You think that tractor's about memory. I think you're scared to let anything go." That one landed deeper than she meant it to. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Caleb bent down near the seat and tugged at something stuck beneath the metal frame. "What's this?" Walt turned. The boy held a small strip of dirty oilcloth pinched between his fingers. Walt stepped closer and carefully took it from him. There was faded blue ink on the fabric. Not many words left, but enough. Pocket, north ditch, cottonwoods. His pulse slowed. Not from calm, from recognition. June noticed the change in his face immediately. "What is it?" Walt folded the cloth carefully into his palm. "Nothing yet." Outside, thunder rolled low across the plains again. Caleb looked toward the east pasture through the rain. "Grandpa?" he asked quietly. "Why does that field always dry faster than the others?" Walt looked out toward the distant line of cottonwood trees bending in the wind. "Because underneath that ground, hidden far below the green spring grass and black Kansas soil, something old was still waiting. And he was beginning to fear nobody but him remembered where it was." By Tuesday morning, Prairie Horizon survey trucks were parked along the east fence. They looked too clean for that road. White paint, company logos, chrome toolboxes, yellow warning lights still blinking though nothing was moving. A drone lifted from the tailgate of one truck and hummed above the fields like a metal wasp. Walt watched from his barn for nearly 10 minutes before he climbed onto the farmel. The old tractor did not want to start. It coughed twice, rattled hard enough to shake dust from the rafters, then finally caught with a rough, uneven growl. Walt eased it out of the barn and rolled slowly toward the fence line, its narrow front tires cutting through damp grass. By the time he arrived, Evan Rusk was standing with a tablet in one hand and a soil probe crew behind him. Evan looked up, not surprised, but not pleased either. "Morning, Mr. Granger." Walt shut the farmall down. "You're too close to the cottonwoods." One of the younger workers glanced at the tractor and smirked. "That thing drive itself too." A couple of men laughed. Evan gave them a quick look, enough to quiet them. "We're just collecting readings," he said. "No heavy equipment today." "That's where it starts," Walt replied. Evan stepped closer to the fence, The drainage corridor is marked 27 yards east of this line. We're outside it. No, Walt said. You're outside where the new map says it is. He pointed with one stiff finger toward the old cottonwoods, their bare spring branches reaching over the low ground like dark hands. The old ditch curved west, right there, ran under that rise, and came out below Harlan's south pasture. Evan looked at his tablet. There's no registered ditch there, because it got filled. By who? Walt's jaw tightened. For a second, he said nothing. The silence was small, but Evan noticed it. Walt looked away and pointed toward a half-buried stone near the fence corner. Grass had grown over most of it, but part of the face showed through the mud. See that? Evan turned. It's a boundary stone, Walt said. G1912. My grandfather said it when the first drainage line was cut through here. A worker walked over, scraped the grass back with his boot, and shrugged. It's just a rock. Walt's eyes sharpened. Rocks out here don't write their own names. Buck Harlan had wandered over from the road by then, coffee thermos in hand. He leaned on the fence and smiled like he had come to watch a show. Walt, you bothering these boys again? I'm trying to keep them from making a mistake. Buck chuckled. Seems to me they got computers for that now. Evan kept his voice controlled. Mr. Granger, I respect your history with this land, but this site has been reviewed. We have insurance. We have county permission. We have engineering approval. You got everything but memory. That landed wrong. Evan's face cooled. Sir, I need to ask you not to interfere with marked survey operations. The lease gives Prairie Horizon access to this section. Walt looked past him at the darker strip of soil near the cottonwoods. It was barely visible unless a man had spent his life noticing such things. The grass grew thicker there, greener. Too green for ground that was supposed to drain. He climbed down slowly from the farmall and walked to the fence. You put 12 tons over that patch after a hard rain, he said, and it won't care what your tablet says. Nobody answered. Then one of the survey trucks backed toward the low spot to turn around. Its rear tire slipped into a shallow depression. Only a few inches. Not enough to panic anybody. The driver gave it gas, and the truck rocked free with a wet sucking sound. The men laughed it off, but Walt did not laugh. He stood perfectly still, staring at the mark the tire left behind. Black mud had risen through the brown topsoil. Evan saw it too. For one brief moment, the young engineer's confidence flickered. Then the drone hummed overhead. The tablet beeped in his hand, and the crew went back to work. Walt climbed onto the farmall without another word. But as he drove away, he knew the field had just whispered its first warning. And nobody but him had heard it clearly. By Friday afternoon, Harper and Sons Equipment had turned its front lot into a county fair without the livestock. Banners snapped in the wind. New tractors sat in polished rows, their green, red, and yellow paint shining under a hard Kansas sun. There were hot dogs under a tent, paper cups of lemonade, and children climbing in and out of cab steps while their fathers pretended not to be impressed by the prices. Prairie Horizon had a display near the center of the lot. A scale model of the automated planter sat on a black tablecloth, surrounded by brochures with bright photos and words like efficiency, precision, and future-ready farming. Walt Granger came alone. He wore his cleanest denim shirt and carried a folded map inside a brown envelope. He had found it the night before in Ellen's cedar chest, tucked between old Christmas cards and a photograph of their wedding day. The paper was brittle, water-stained, and soft at the creases, but it showed the Eastfield before the modern county maps had cleaned it up. Walt had barely slept after finding it. Now he stood at the edge of the crowd, waiting while Evan Rusk spoke with 2 county commissioners and Marlene Price. Finally, Walt stepped forward. "Mr. Rusk?" Evan turned. His expression tightened just a little before he made it polite. "Mr. Granger." Walt held out the envelope. "You need to look at this." Evan hesitated, then took it. The paper inside unfolded poorly. One corner had stuck to itself from old moisture, and when Evan tried to open it wider, the crease tore with a dry whisper. Walt flinched like someone had cut skin. Evan studied the faded lines. "What am I looking at?" "Old drainage map. Before they straightened the county records." A few people gathered closer. Buck Harlan drifted in from the lemonade table, chewing slowly and grinning like he smelled embarrassment coming. Walt pointed at a faint blue line. "That ditch ran here, not there. And this mark." He tapped the paper. The ink had blurred, but 2 words could still be made out if the light hit right. "Black Pocket." Evan leaned closer. For a moment, Walt thought he saw real attention in the young man's face. Then Marlene Price stepped beside them. "Is that an official county document?" Walt swallowed. "It's from my family records." "Is it surveyed?" "It was drawn by the drainage crew." "Stamped." Walt said nothing. Marlene's silence answered for him. Evan folded the map carefully, but his voice had turned professional again. "I can't redesign a permitted demonstration around an unstamped family map." "It ain't family folklore." "I didn't say it was. You're treating it like it is." The crowd had grown thick enough now that Walt could feel eyes on his back. A young salesman from Harper & Sons laughed and said, "Next, he'll bring out a ghost with a transit pole." Somebody else muttered, "Ghost maps and museum tractors." The line moved through the crowd and came back as laughter. Not loud at first, then louder. Walt looked down at the torn corner of the map, trembling in Evan's hand. June stood near the parts counter with Caleb beside her. She had arrived without telling Walt, hoping to talk sense into him before he did something public. But she was too late. "Dad," she said softly. He turned. Her face carried worry, shame, and hurt all mixed together. Marlene lowered her voice, though not enough. "Walter, the bank cannot keep extending patience based on old stories." Walt took the map back from Evan. For a second, he looked smaller than he had that morning. Caleb stepped toward him, but June held the boy's shoulder. Outside the circle of people, wind lifted the edge of the map and tore one weakened corner clean away. The scrap skipped across the concrete and stuck against the tire of a new tractor. Caleb saw the words on it before anyone else did. "Black Pocket." That evening, Walt sat alone in the barn with Harper's business card in one hand. He looked at the farmall, looked at the card, then, almost against himself, he reached for the old tractor's toolbox. Inside, beneath a crusted wrench and a coil of baling wire, lay a small brass key tied to a worn shoelace. Walt stared at it, breath caught in his throat, because he had not seen that key since the year his father died. The brass key was colder than it should have been. Walt held it under the barn light, turning it slowly between his fingers. The shoelace tied through its ring had gone stiff with age, the knot darkened by oil and dust. For a long while, he simply stood there, listening to the wind press against the barn walls. Then he walked to the west side of the building, where old boards bowed inward behind a stack of feed sacks. His father had always kept things in places no thief would bother checking. Walt pulled the sacks aside, pried one loose board with the claw of a hammer, and found a small tin box hidden inside the wall. The lock was brown with rust. His hand shook before the key even touched it. It opened on the second try. Inside lay a cloth-covered notebook, 3 folded receipts, a black and white photograph, and a short letter in Ellen's handwriting. Walt did not touch the letter first. He was afraid to. Instead, he lifted the notebook. The cover smelled of mildew, tobacco, and machine oil. His father's handwriting filled the pages in tight lines, dated after the flood of 1951. There were notes on rain, soil, ditch depth, wagon tracks, and one phrase repeated more than once: black pocket. Walt sat on an overturned bucket and read by the yellow barn bulb. The black pocket was not a pond, not exactly. It was a buried place beneath the east field where old peat and river silt held water long after the surface dried hard. His father had written that the top crust could fool a man, a horse, even a tractor, especially after spring rain. One entry made Walt's throat tighten. June 3rd, 1951. Baker threshing rig sunk to rear axle. Heavy crawler failed on West Pull. Farmall held on ridge line near Cottonwoods. Low hook saved the draw. Never cross center after wet week. Walt turned to the receipts. One was from Harper Machinery, dated 1952 for narrow rear wheels and a low drawbar modification on the Farmall. His father had not changed that tractor for looks. He had changed it because the ground out east required a certain kind of patience, a certain kind of pull. Then Walt picked up the photograph. Men stood ankle deep in mud beside a half-sunk threshing machine. In the background, sitting high on a narrow strip of ground near the cottonwoods, was the Farmall. Bright red then, proud, young, like Walt had once been. He closed his eyes. Memory came quietly at first, then harder. Years after his father died, Walt had filled part of that old drainage cut. Corn prices were low. Ellen was sick. The bank was calling twice a week. He needed more plantable acres, even if it was only a thin strip near the east line. He told himself the ditch was useless. He told himself modern tiling had solved what old men used shovels to fear. So he filled it, one load at a time. The shame of that settled over him now heavier than any laugh at Harper and Sons. This was not only Evan's mistake, not only Prairie Horizons. Some of that danger had Walt Granger's own fingerprints buried in it. Only then did he unfold Ellen's letter. It was not long. Walter, if you ever find this, don't mistake holding on for keeping faith. Your father saved that tractor because it taught him how to listen, not because iron is sacred. Listen first, then decide what must be saved. Walt pressed the paper against his knee. Outside, a truck pulled into the yard. Caleb's small voice called from the barn door. "Grandpa." Walt quickly closed the notebook, but the boy had already seen the photograph lying on the bucket. Caleb stepped closer and pointed. "Why is that big machine sunk?" he asked. "But your tractor is still sitting on top." Walt looked from the photo to the farmall, then out toward the dark east field. For the first time since the meeting, he knew he had proof. But proof, he feared, had come carrying a confession. The next morning, Walt drove to the Miller County Records office with the notebook wrapped in a towel on the passenger seat. The courthouse sat in Barlow, 12 miles west of Mason Creek, with limestone steps worn smooth by 100 years of boots, lawyers, brides, farmers, and men who came in praying the county had kept better records than they had. Walt parked under an elm tree and sat for a minute before going in. He did not like asking for help, especially not when the help might prove he had been wrong too. Inside, the records room smelled of paper, floor wax, and old heat. Behind the counter sat Ruth Bell, a small woman in her late 70s with silver hair pinned high and reading glasses hanging from a chain. She looked up and smiled. "Walter Granger. Haven't seen you in here since Ellen filed that garden club permit." Walt held his hat in both hands. "Need to find an old drainage map." "How old?" "1912. Maybe copied after the '51 flood." Ruth's smile faded into seriousness. "Your father's east ground." Walt nodded. She pushed herself up slowly. "Then we'd better look in the basement." For nearly an hour, they searched through drawers, rolled plats, brittle index cards, and boxes labeled in handwriting from clerks long dead. Ruth found references to the Granger drainage line, and even a ledger number. But the map itself was missing from the county box where it should have been. "Misfiled," Ruth muttered, "or borrowed and never returned. Happens more than folks like to think." Walt stared at the empty folder. The notebook suddenly felt smaller under his arm. A door opened behind them. Evan Rusk stepped into the records room carrying a permit envelope. For a moment, both men froze. Evan glanced at the towel-wrapped notebook. "Mr. Granger." Walt took it out and laid it on the counter. "You need to read this." Evan hesitated, then came closer. Ruth watched without speaking. Walt opened to the marked page. The words "black pocket" sat there in his father's careful handwriting, surrounded by measurements, dates, ditch notes, and the line about the farmel holding the ridge near the cottonwoods. Evan read longer than Walt expected. His face changed. Not enough to call belief, but enough to show doubt had found a crack. "This is detailed," Evan said quietly. "Detailed enough to move your demonstration." Evan closed the notebook with care. "It's a personal field journal. It's not stamped. It's not verified by the county. If I delay now without official support, Prairie Horizon could lose contracts, funding, and insurance coverage. Better than losing the machine. You don't know that will happen." Walt's mouth tightened. "No," he said. "I know what happens when men think dry dirt means safe dirt." Evan looked away first. Ruth tapped one finger on the counter. There might be another copy. Both men turned. "After the 1951 flood," she said, "the church basement was used for emergency storage. Some drainage documents were copied for shelter planning. If the church never cleaned those files out, there may be something there." Walt felt a small spark rise in him. Then his phone buzzed. "June." He stepped into the hall to answer. Her voice was tight. "Dad, Marlene called me." Walt shut his eyes. "She said the bank is starting inventory on pledged equipment if payment isn't arranged." "I'll handle it." "No, you won't. That's the problem. You keep saying that." When Walt got back to Granger Bend that afternoon, the first thing he saw was a yellow paper tag wired to the Farmall's steering column. "Collateral inventory? First Prairie Bank?" For a long time, he stood in the barn doorway without moving. The tractor was still there, but it no longer felt entirely his. At sunrise the next morning, Mason Creek Radio announced that Prairie Horizons public field demonstration would proceed Saturday afternoon, following expected overnight rain. Walt turned the radio off. Then he looked toward the east field. The sky was already darkening. It rained hard Friday night. Not the kind of rain that made news, but the kind farmers noticed in their bones. It came steady from dusk until sometime past midnight, soaking the stubble, filling low tracks, and turning the ditches along Pine Hollow Road into narrow brown streams. By Saturday afternoon, the sun had returned. That was the dangerous part. The east field looked almost innocent under the clean light. The wind had dried the surface just enough to give it a pale crust. From the road, the ground appeared firm, level, and ready. People started arriving after lunch. County trucks parked along the fence. First Prairie Bank set up a blue canopy. Prairie Horizon employees unloaded displays, safety cones, and a small speaker system. Farmers came in seed caps and work jackets, some curious, some hopeful, some only there to see whether the machine could do what men used to do from sunrise to dark. Walt stood alone near the old cottonwoods. He had not brought a chair. He had brought the Farmall. It sat behind him, idling unevenly, the yellow bank tag still wired to the steering column. Every few breaths, the old tractor coughed smoke through its stack like it was clearing its throat before speaking. June arrived with Caleb just as Evan Rusk stepped up to the microphone. Walt saw his daughter before she saw him. She looked worried, but she came anyway. Caleb ran straight to the fence. "Grandpa!" Walt lifted one hand. June looked at the Farmall, then at the field. "Dad, please tell me you're not planning something." "I'm planning on being wrong," Walt said. She frowned. He kept his eyes on the low ground. "I'd like that better." Across the field, the $1 million machine rolled down from its trailer. The crowd reacted almost as one. It was enormous up close. Wide tires, folded arms, cameras mounted like eyes, metal panels clean enough to reflect the sky. A machine built from money, software, steel, and confidence. Evan spoke about reduced labor costs, seed placement accuracy, automated balance control, and the future of rural agriculture. His voice carried well over the speakers, but his eyes kept drifting toward the cottonwoods. He had doubts now. Not enough to stop, but enough to make him check the ground twice. Marlene Price stood beneath the bank canopy with county officials, her smile careful and tight. Buck Harlan leaned against his pickup, arms crossed, watching Walt more than the machine. "Still think the field's gonna bite?" Buck called. Walt did not answer. The demonstration began. For the first 100 yards, the machine performed beautifully. It moved with slow, eerie precision, turning in a clean line while its sensors adjusted each section over the uneven ground. The crowd applauded. Someone whistled. Evan's shoulders loosened a little. Then the machine crossed the pale strip near the cottonwoods. Walt's hand closed around the fence wire. The left rear tire dipped, only a little at first. Then the hydraulic system hissed and shifted weight to correct the angle. That was when the earth opened. Black mud pushed up around the tire in a thick, shining ring. The machine's rear section dropped with a heavy groan. The front tried to compensate, but the balancing system only drove the opposite side deeper. The applause died. Evan shouted into his radio. The machine lurched forward 6 inches, then sank another foot. Mud burst from underneath it, dark as oil. A support truck rushed in from the road, but its driver braked hard when the front wheels began to slide sideways. Another tractor backed toward the field edge and stopped before reaching the wet strip. Nobody laughed now. Caleb tugged June's sleeve and pointed at the farmall's fender. "Mom," he whispered. P, that's Black Pocket." June turned toward the old carved letters. Her face went pale. Across the field, Evan was running toward Walt, boots slipping in the grass. When he reached the fence, his voice was no longer polished. "Can you get close enough?" Walt looked at the sinking machine, then at the farmall behind him. The old tractor rattled softly, as if it already knew what he was about to ask of it. "If I go in wrong," Walt said, "she'll bury both machines." For a moment, Evan Rusk did not answer. The young engineer looked back at the machine, then at the field, then at the crowd standing uselessly along the fence. All the polished language from the meeting hall was gone now. No charts, no projections, no bright future on a screen. Just black mud climbing higher around $1 million machine. "What do you need?" Evan asked. Walt looked at him carefully. That question mattered. Not because it made Walt feel powerful, because it meant Evan was finally ready to listen. "Turn off the self-balance system," Walt said. "Every time it fights the lean, it digs itself deeper." Evan grabbed his radio. "Shut down auto-leveling. Manual lock. Now." Walt pointed toward the old cottonwoods. "I need that shallow cut opened. 5 men with shovels. Don't dig wide. Dig where the grass is darkest." Buck Harlan pushed off his truck. "You serious?" Walt looked at him. "You got that long logging chain in your shed." Buck's grin disappeared. "Yeah. Go get it." For once, Buck did not argue. Within minutes, the field turned into organized confusion. Men who had been laughing an hour earlier were now running for shovels, chain, blocks, and timber planks. June stood near the fence with Caleb pressed against her side, watching Walt climb onto the farmall. The old tractor shook beneath him. Walt could feel every loose bolt, every tired bearing. Every year his father had trusted it, and every year he had asked it to sit quietly in the dark. "Come on, girl," he whispered. He eased the farmall forward, not toward the machine, but along the ridge near the cottonwoods. The path was hardly a path at all, just a narrow rise hidden beneath grass, the same one his father had marked in the notebook. The crowd went silent as the old tractor rolled out. Its narrow tires cut shallow tracks where heavier machines would have broken through. Walt kept the throttle low. Too much speed would tear the crust. Too little would kill the engine. Mud slapped against the rear wheels. The farmer coughed once. June held her breath. Walt stopped at an angle nobody expected. Well, short of the sunken machine. Evan ran the chain out with 2 other men, boots sinking to their ankles. Buck returned in his pickup, breathless, dragging the old logging chain from the bed. "Never thought I'd see this thing used again," Buck muttered. Walt pointed. "Low drawbar, not the axle. If it hooks high, it flips me." The words made June step forward. "Dad." He did not look at her. "Stay back." They hooked the chain. It stretched from the farmer's low drawbar to the frame of the trapped machine, running across mud like a dark steel line. Evan climbed onto the machine's side platform and waited for Walt's signal. "Neutral," Walt called. "No power unless I tell you." Evan nodded. Walt let out the clutch. The chain lifted from the mud. The farmall leaned into the pull. For 3 long seconds, nothing moved. Then the old tractor's rear wheels spun, throwing black mud in 2 slow fans. The engine barked, choked, and nearly died. "Stop," Walt shouted. He pushed the clutch in and sat breathing hard. Someone in the crowd whispered, "It can't do it." Walt heard it. For 1 terrible second, he believed it too. Then water began trickling through the shallow cut near the cottonwoods. The ditch was opening. The ground was letting go. Just a little. Walt turned the steering wheel 2 feet left. Not much. Just enough. He remembered his father's voice as clearly as if the old man were standing beside him. "Don't fight the mud straight. Make it choose which grip to lose." Walt eased the clutch again. The chain tightened. The farmall groaned. The big machine shuddered once. Then it moved. Only an inch. But every person there saw it. "Hold," Walt shouted. "Let the water run." The ditch pulled more black water away from the tires. Evan stood frozen, eyes wide, hands gripping the rail. Walt pulled a 3rd time. This time, the machine came free with a deep, sucking roar that rolled across the field like thunder underground. Mud collapsed behind it. The giant planter lurched backward, then rose onto firmer ground as men shouted and scattered. For 1 wild moment, the whole crowd erupted. Then a sharp crack split the air. The farmall lurched. Walt killed the engine. Oil began to drip from beneath the rear housing, dark and steady into the mud. The old tractor had given everything it had. Walt climbed down slowly and placed 1 hand on the faded red fender. No one laughed. No one spoke. Then, from the back of the crowd, Ruth Bell's voice called out, "Walter." She was walking across the grass, holding a yellowed envelope against her chest. "I found the church copy." Ruth Bell reached the fence with mud on the hem of her coat, and the yellowed envelope held tight in both hands. No one moved toward her at first. The field still smelled of torn earth, hot oil, and diesel. The Prairie Horizon machine sat crooked but free on firmer ground, dripping black mud from its frame. The farmall stood a few yards away, silent now, its old red body streaked dark, oil bleeding slowly beneath the rear housing. Ruth opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a folded map, brittle at the edges, but clear enough to make every person there lean closer. Miller County Drainage Survey, 1912. There it was. The old ditch, the Cottonwood Ridge, the low crossing. And written in faded ink near the exact place where the $1 million machine had sunk were two words Walt had carried like a burden most of his life. Black Pocket. Evan stared at the map for a long time. Then he looked at Walt. "I should have listened closer," he said. It was not dramatic. It was not loud, but everybody heard it. Walt wiped mud from his hand onto his jeans. "You listened when it mattered." Marlene Price stepped forward, next. Her face was pale, and for once, she did not look like a banker calculating risk. She looked like a woman who had just seen how close a whole town had come to disaster. "Walter," she said quietly, "the bank will suspend equipment action until this matter is reviewed." Walt nodded, but his eyes stayed on the farmal. By Monday morning, Prairie Horizon had postponed the demonstration project. By the next week, Evan returned to Granger Bend with new surveyors. Not to argue, but to walk the land with Walt. They marked the old ditch again. They reopened part of it, which meant Walt lost a strip of plantable ground he had once fought hard to gain. He did not complain. Some debts were not paid in money. Harper and Sons hauled the farmall to their shop on a flatbed. Buck Harlan showed up without being asked, carrying tools and pretending he only came because he had nothing better to do. June came that Saturday with Caleb, and together they cleaned the barn bay where the tractor had sat for so many years. At Mason Diner, folks stopped laughing when Walt's name came up. They did not make him a hero. They simply nodded when he walked in. That suited him fine. One evening, near sunset, Walt stood in the barn doorway beside Caleb. The farmall was back home now, propped carefully on blocks, not ready to run, maybe not for a long while. Its red paint still looked tired. The cracked headlight was still cracked, but the carved letters on the fender had been cleaned until they could be read again. B.P. Caleb placed one small hand on the steering wheel. "When it's fixed," the boy asked, "will you teach me how to listen to the ground?" Walt looked out across the east field, where the reopened ditch caught the last gold light of evening. For the first time in a long while, the old farmer smiled. "Yeah," he said softly, "but first, you learn to be quiet enough to hear it. Some stories do not end with everything repaired. Sometimes the farm is still in debt. Sometimes the old tractor still needs parts. Sometimes the people who love each other still have hard conversations waiting for them across the kitchen table. But maybe that is what makes a story feel true. Walter Granger did not win because he was louder than everyone else. He did not win because the past was better than the future. He won because he remembered something the world had almost thrown away, that land has memory. Machines have limits. And wisdom often comes wearing worn boots and quiet eyes. Maybe you have known someone like Walt, an old farmer, a father, a grandfather, a neighbor, someone who did not say much, but somehow knew when rain was coming, when a field was wrong, when a machine needed patience, or when a family needed holding together. If this story reminded you of someone, share their name or memory in the comments. And if you have not already, tell us where you are watching from and what time it is there. It is always special to see how far these small town stories travel. If stories like this still mean something to you, leave a like, write a comment, and subscribe for more American Heartland stories about old wisdom, family farms, and the quiet people who prove their worth when it matters most. Script completed. One of the hardest lessons life teaches is that wisdom does not always arrive dressed in something new. Sometimes it lives in old hands, old memories, quiet habits, and people the world has stopped listening to. We live in a time where speed, technology, and progress move so fast that many people forget the value of experience earned through years of struggle, failure, patience, and survival. But the truth is, there are some things no machine, no computer, and no modern system can fully replace: instinct, character, and the kind of understanding that only comes from living through storms. Stories like this remind us not to judge people too quickly just because they move slower. Speak softer, or hold on to old things. Sometimes the people who seem left behind are carrying the very knowledge that can save everyone when trouble finally comes. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to leave a comment and share where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you believe stories about family, hard work, rural life, and old-fashioned wisdom still matter today, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join us for more heartfelt American storytelling.